King Alexander stood at the tall windows of Windsor Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the royal gardens. At 55, he carried the weight of the crown with quiet dignity, but, lately, that weight felt heavier than ever. The kingdom of Astoria had been his responsibility for 20 years, ever since his father's passing, and, in all that time, he had never faced a decision quite like this one. His marriage to Queen Isabella had been arranged 30 years ago, a union designed to strengthen political ties between Astoria and the neighboring kingdom of Valdres. They had been young then, barely knowing each other, but they had tried to make it work. Isabella was beautiful, intelligent, and perfectly suited for royal duties. She understood protocol, spoke 5 languages, and could charm foreign dignitaries with ease. On paper, she was everything a queen should be. But love had never truly bloomed between them. They had shared a life, raised their son Prince Marcus together, and presented a united front to the world. Yet in private moments like this, Alexander couldn't ignore the emptiness that had grown between them over the years. They were more like business partners than husband and wife, going through the motions of a royal marriage while their hearts remained distant. The sound of footsteps on marble interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Lady Catherine approaching, her arms full of documents for the morning briefing. At 38, she had served as his personal secretary and advisor for the past 8 years, and, in that time, she had become indispensable to both his work and, if he was honest with himself, his emotional well-being. Catherine had joined the royal staff after her divorce from a prominent businessman. She was brilliant, organized, and had an uncanny ability to understand what Alexander needed before he even knew it himself. More importantly, she treated him like a person rather than just a title. In her presence, he could laugh, share his worries, and be himself in ways that felt impossible with anyone else. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Catherine said, setting the papers on his desk. "The Prime Minister will be here in an hour to discuss the trade negotiations with Merida. I've prepared the briefing notes you requested." "Thank you, Catherine. What would I do without you?" Alexander's voice carried a warmth that went beyond mere appreciation for efficient work. She smiled, the kind of genuine smile that lit up her green eyes. "I'm sure you'd manage just fine, though perhaps with a bit more chaos in your schedule." Their eyes met for a moment longer than was strictly professional, and Alexander felt that familiar flutter in his chest that he had been trying to ignore for months. Catherine seemed to feel it too, because she quickly looked away, busying herself with arranging the documents. This was the problem that kept Alexander awake at night. Somewhere along the way, his working relationship with Catherine had evolved into something deeper. He found himself looking forward to their daily meetings, seeking her opinion on matters both professional and personal, and treasuring the rare moments when her formal demeanor relaxed, and he glimpsed the woman behind the efficient advisor. He knew she felt something too. It was in the way her voice softened when they spoke privately, how her hand would linger just a second too long when passing him documents, and the concern in her eyes when she thought he was pushing himself too hard. Neither of them had spoken of it directly, but the unspoken understanding hung between them like morning mist. The situation was impossible, of course. He was married to Isabella, and, despite their loveless union, divorce was not something kings of Astoria took lightly. The last royal divorce had been 200 years ago, and it had nearly torn the kingdom apart. The church, the nobility, and many of his subjects would be scandalized. His son Marcus, now 26, and heir to the throne, would be devastated by the public humiliation. Yet Alexander found himself increasingly unable to ignore his heart. Life was short, and he had spent 3 decades in a marriage that satisfied duty but starved his soul. Was he destined to spend his remaining years the same way, watching Catherine from a distance while pretending to be content with a wife who had become little more than a stranger? The morning briefing with Catherine proceeded as usual, but Alexander's mind wandered. He watched her explain the economic reports, noting how her brow furrowed slightly when she concentrated, how she tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear when she was thinking. These small details had become precious to him, evidence of a real person behind the professional facade. After she left, Alexander remained at his desk, staring at the papers without really seeing them. The trade negotiations with Merida seemed trivial compared to the negotiations happening in his own heart. He thought about Isabella, probably in her private sitting room at that very moment, planning another charity gala or reviewing guest lists for state dinners. She would execute whatever event she was planning with perfect precision, just as she had done thousands of times before. But when was the last time they had really talked? When had they last shared a laugh or a meaningful conversation about anything other than royal duties? He remembered their early years together, how hard they had both tried to create something real between them. But their personalities had never quite meshed. Isabella was reserved where he was warm, formal where he preferred casual moments, focused on appearances where he cared more about substance. They had settled into a pattern of polite coexistence, and somehow 25 years had passed that way. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had found the connection he had always craved with someone who worked for him. Catherine understood his sense of humor, shared his love of history, and could engage him in conversations that lasted for hours. She had never been awed by his title the way others were, instead treating him with a respect that felt earned rather than automatic. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Prince Marcus entered, his expression troubled. At 26, Marcus had his father's height and his mother's aristocratic features, but his personality was uniquely his own. He was passionate about environmental causes, preferred casual clothes to formal wear whenever possible, and had been pushing for reforms that would modernize the monarchy. "Father, do you have a minute? I wanted to talk to you about something." Alexander gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Marcus settled into the chair, running his hands through his dark hair. "I've been hearing rumors around the palace. Staff gossip, mostly, but it's concerning. They're saying you and Mother barely speak to each other anymore, that you seem unhappy." Alexander felt his stomach tighten. If the palace staff had noticed, how long before the press picked up on it? "Your mother and I are fine, Marcus. We've always had different interests." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'm not blind, Father. I've lived here my whole life. I can see that you and Mother have been growing apart for years. And lately, I've noticed how you light up when Lady Catherine is around." The directness of the observation hit Alexander like a physical blow. "Marcus, I think you're reading too much into, am I? Because if there's something going on, I need to know. Not as your son, but as the heir to the throne. Whatever decisions you make affect the entire kingdom." Alexander stood and walked back to the window, his mind racing. Marcus was right, of course. Any major change in the royal family structure would have far-reaching consequences. The stability of the monarchy depended partly on the image of a strong, united royal family. "There's nothing inappropriate happening," Alexander said carefully. "Catherine is my advisor, nothing more. But you wish it could be something more." It wasn't a question. Marcus had inherited his father's ability to read people, and he had clearly seen what others had begun to notice. Alexander turned to face his son, seeing understanding and concern in the young man's eyes. "What I wish for isn't always what's best for the kingdom," Alexander replied. "But what about what's best for you as a person? You've given your entire life to this crown, Father. Don't you deserve some happiness?" The question hung in the air between them. Alexander had always tried to shield Marcus from the lonelier aspects of royal life, but perhaps he hadn't been as successful as he had hoped. His son seemed to understand the sacrifice that wearing the crown required. "The happiness of one person can't outweigh the stability of thousands," Alexander said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "But what if that person is miserable? What kind of king can you be if you're living a lie?" Marcus's words echoed thoughts that Alexander had been having more frequently. Could he continue to rule effectively while feeling increasingly trapped in his personal life? And what message was he sending to his son about duty versus personal fulfillment? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Prime Minister, but Marcus's questions stayed with Alexander throughout the day. As he moved through his scheduled meetings and appointments, he found himself more aware than ever of the contrast between his public role and his private feelings. That evening, Alexander joined Isabella for their customary dinner together. They sat at opposite ends of a long dining table, discussing the day's events with the practiced ease of two people who had performed this ritual thousands of times. Isabella updated him on her latest charitable initiatives, while he shared highlights from his meetings with government officials. As always, their conversation was pleasant but surface level. Isabella had perfected the art of royal small talk, but Alexander found himself wondering when they had stopped sharing their real thoughts with each other. Had there ever been a time when they had truly connected, or had their entire marriage been an elaborate performance? "You seem distracted tonight," Isabella observed, taking a sip of wine. "Just thinking about the Meridian negotiations. Complex situation. I'm sure you'll handle it well. You always do." Her confidence in his abilities was genuine, but it felt more like the trust one might have in a competent colleague than the faith of a loving wife. Alexander realized that he couldn't remember the last time Isabella had asked him how he felt about something, rather than simply assuming he would manage whatever challenges arose. After dinner, they went their separate ways as usual. Isabella to her private apartments to read and prepare for the next day's obligations, Alexander to his study to review documents. It was a routine they had followed for years, and tonight it felt particularly hollow. Sitting alone in his study, Alexander opened a folder of trade agreements, but found himself unable to concentrate. Instead, he thought about his conversation with Catherine that morning, how easily they had discussed complex issues, how her insights had helped him see problems from new angles. With Catherine, conversation felt effortless and engaging. With Isabella, it felt like work. He thought about Marcus's question, what kind of king could he be if he was living a lie? The truth was, he had been living a lie for years, pretending to be content with a marriage that had long since ceased to bring either partner joy. He had told himself it was noble, this sacrifice for duty, but perhaps it was simply cowardice. The clock chimed midnight, and Alexander realized he had been sitting in the same position for hours, lost in thought. Tomorrow would bring another day of royal obligations, another day of managing the careful balance between his public role and his private feelings. But tonight, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to really consider what it might be like to choose differently. He thought about Catherine's smile, about conversations that energized rather than drained him, about what it might feel like to be truly known and loved by someone who saw past his title to the man underneath. It was a dangerous thought, one that could reshape not just his life, but the entire future of the kingdom. As he finally made his way to his private chambers, Alexander knew that change was coming. He could feel it in the air like an approaching storm. The only question was whether he would have the courage to meet it head-on, or if he would continue hiding behind duty and tradition while his heart slowly withered away. The next morning would bring new challenges, new choices, and perhaps new possibilities. But tonight, King Alexander allowed himself to dream of what happiness might actually look like. Even if he wasn't yet ready to reach for it. 3 months had passed since Alexander's late-night reflections, and the undercurrent of tension in Windsor Palace had only grown stronger. The autumn season brought with it a series of state functions that required the royal family to present a united front, but those who knew them well could sense the strain beneath the polished surface. Lady Catherine had begun to notice the change in the king's demeanor during their daily meetings. Where once he had been focused and decisive, now he seemed distracted, often staring out the window mid-conversation or asking her to repeat information she had just shared. She found herself wondering if he was unwell, though he appeared physically healthy. There was something else troubling him, something deeper than the usual pressures of ruling a kingdom. The morning of the annual harvest festival dawned crisp and clear. This was one of Astoria's most beloved traditions, where the royal family would walk among the people, sample local foods, and celebrate the kingdom's agricultural heritage. It required hours of public appearances, smiling for cameras, and making pleasant conversation with hundreds of citizens. Catherine arrived early to brief Alexander on the day's schedule. She found him already dressed in his formal ceremonial uniform, standing before a mirror while his valet made final adjustments. The deep blue jacket with its golden embroidery and ceremonial medals made him look every inch the king, but Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders. "Good morning, Your Majesty. I have the final schedule for today's events." She set the papers on his desk, noting how his reflection in the mirror showed tired eyes despite the early hour. "Thank you." Alexander dismissed his valet with a nod and turned to face her. "Catherine, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. "Of course. Do you think I'm a good king?" The question caught her off guard. In all their years of working together, he had never shown such uncertainty about his abilities. "I think you're an exceptional king. The kingdom has prospered under your leadership, and your people respect and admire you." "That's not what I meant." Alexander moved closer, his formal demeanor dropping away. "Do you think I can continue to be a good king if I'm not being true to myself?" Catherine felt the dangerous territory they were entering. This conversation was heading somewhere that could change everything between them. "I think authenticity is important in any role, but especially in leadership. People can sense when someone is being genuine. And if being genuine means making choices that others might see as selfish." She studied his face, seeing vulnerability there that he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "I think that depends on whether those choices ultimately serve a greater good, even if the path there is difficult." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the palace staff preparing for the day's events. But, inside his study, the world felt very small and very intimate. Catherine, I need you to know that working with you these past 8 years has been... He paused, searching for the right words. You've become more important to me than I should probably admit. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain professional. You're an easy person to work for, Your Majesty. I've enjoyed our collaboration as well. No, that's not what I mean, and I think you know it. Alexander took another step closer. I mean that somewhere along the way, I stopped looking forward to our meetings because of the work we accomplish. I started looking forward to them because of you. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge that once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Catherine felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Your Majesty, she began, but he gently interrupted her. Please, just for a moment, could you call me Alexander? Not Your Majesty, not Sir, just my name. The simple request felt monumental. In 8 years of working together, she had never called him by his first name. It would cross a line that had kept their relationship safely in professional territory. Alexander, she said softly, and heard how different his name sounded when spoken with affection rather than formality. I know this is complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons why these feelings I have for you are impossible. But I can't pretend they don't exist anymore. Catherine felt tears threatening to spill over. She had been harboring the same feelings for months, maybe years, but had convinced herself they were one-sided, a foolish crush on a man who was completely out of reach. I care about you too, she whispered. More than I should. More than is wise. The confession seemed to release something in both of them. Alexander reached out and gently touched her hand, and the simple contact sent electricity through both of them. What do we do now? Catherine asked, her voice barely audible. Before Alexander could answer, there was a sharp knock on the door. They sprang apart, Catherine quickly gathering the papers while Alexander straightened his uniform jacket. Come in, Alexander called, his voice carefully controlled. Queen Isabella entered, resplendent in a burgundy coat and matching hat, every inch the perfect royal consort. Alexander, they're ready for us in the courtyard. The car is waiting. Of course. Catherine was just finishing the briefing. Isabella's gaze moved between them, and, for a moment, Catherine wondered if the Queen had sensed the charged atmosphere in the room. But Isabella simply nodded politely. Lady Catherine, I trust everything is arranged properly for today? Yes, Your Majesty. The schedule has been coordinated with security, and all the local officials have been briefed. Excellent. Alexander, shall we go? As the royal couple left for their public duties, Catherine remained in the study, her hands shaking slightly as she gathered the remaining papers. Everything had changed in the space of a few minutes, and she had no idea what would happen next. The harvest festival proceeded flawlessly from a public perspective. The royal couple moved through the crowds with practiced ease, Alexander charming the farmers and their families while Isabella graciously accepted bouquets of flowers from shy children. Local news cameras captured images of them tasting honey, admiring prize-winning livestock, and laughing at a puppet show performed by local schoolchildren. But Catherine, watching from the sidelines as she coordinated with security and palace staff, could see the subtle signs of strain. Alexander's smiles were perfectly timed, but didn't reach his eyes. Isabella maintained her composure, but seemed to be working harder than usual to project warmth. Most telling of all, they rarely looked directly at each other, and when they did, there was a distance there that hadn't been present in previous years. During a brief break between events, Alexander found himself standing alone near a display of autumn vegetables, while Isabella spoke with the mayor's wife about a new literacy program. Catherine approached to update him on the afternoon schedule. How are you holding up? She asked quietly, pretending to consult her notes while actually studying his face. It's harder than usual today, he admitted. Pretending everything is normal when nothing feels normal anymore. I understand. Do you? Because I've been thinking about what you said, about authenticity and leadership. I wonder if I can continue to be effective as a king when I'm living such a fundamental lie. Catherine glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. What are you thinking of doing? I don't know yet. But I can't continue indefinitely the way things are. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of several local dignitaries, but Catherine could see that Alexander had reached some kind of decision point. The question was whether he would have the courage to act on it, and what the consequences might be. The afternoon events continued without incident, but by evening, when the royal couple returned to the palace, the strain was showing more clearly. Isabella retired to her chambers immediately, claiming fatigue, while Alexander retreated to his study. He had dismissed his evening secretary and was sitting alone when Catherine knocked softly on his door. "Come in," he called, and when he saw her, his whole demeanor softened. "I wanted to make sure you were all right. Today seemed difficult." Alexander gestured for her to sit in the chair across from his desk. It was, "Catherine, what we talked about this morning. I need you to know that I meant every word." "I know you did. I meant what I said too." "Then, we have a problem, don't we?" Catherine nodded slowly. "A very large problem." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in thought. Finally, Alexander spoke again. "I've been thinking about my son's question from a few months ago. He asked me what kind of king I could be if I was living a lie. I think I know the answer now." "What answer is that?" "A declining one. I can feel it already, Catherine. The enthusiasm I used to have for my duties, the energy I brought to solving problems, the genuine care I felt for my people's welfare. It's all becoming harder to access when my personal life feels so hollow." Catherine leaned forward in her chair. "But if you made changes, dramatic changes, wouldn't that create different problems? The stability of the monarchy, public confidence, the line of succession? All valid concerns. But what if the greater threat to stability is a king who's slowly losing his passion for the role? What if pretending to be in a happy marriage is actually making me a worse leader?" It was a question neither of them could answer definitively, but Catherine could see the logic in his thinking. She had watched him over the years, seen how he threw himself into his work with genuine enthusiasm. But, lately, that enthusiasm had been replaced by mere competence, duty without joy. "Have you talked to anyone else about this? Prince Marcus? Your advisors?" "Not directly. But Marcus has made it clear he's noticed the problems in my marriage. As for my advisors, well, most of them would be horrified at the thought of a royal divorce." "And the Queen? Have you talked to Isabella about how you're feeling?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "We don't really talk anymore, not about anything real. We coordinate schedules, discuss public events, share information about Marcus. But actual conversation about feelings, about our relationship, about our future? We stopped having those years ago. Maybe that's where you need to start. Before making any major decisions, maybe you owe it to your marriage to try having those conversations again." It wasn't what Alexander wanted to hear, but he recognized the wisdom in Catherine's suggestion. If he was going to upend his life and potentially damage the monarchy, he needed to be certain that his current situation was truly irreparable. "You're right," he said finally. "I should talk to Isabella first. And I should probably request a transfer to another department," Catherine added quietly. "No." Alexander's response was immediate and firm. "Not yet. I need you here while I figure this out. I can't do this alone." Catherine felt torn between her feelings for Alexander and her sense of propriety. Staying close to him while he sorted out his marriage felt wrong on multiple levels, but she also understood his need for support during what would undoubtedly be a difficult period. "I'll stay," she said. "But we have to be careful. No more moments like this morning. No more personal conversations unless they're absolutely necessary." "Agreed," Alexander said, though they both knew how difficult that promise would be to keep. As Catherine left his study that evening, both of them knew that they had crossed a threshold. The feelings between them were now acknowledged, even if they couldn't be acted upon. The question was whether Alexander would find the courage to address his marriage honestly, and what consequences would follow if he did. In her own apartment that night, Catherine stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She had spent 8 years carefully maintaining professional boundaries, and, in one morning, those boundaries had crumbled completely. She was in love with a married king, and he had just confessed feelings for her that could reshape the future of an entire kingdom. Meanwhile, in the royal chambers, Alexander lay awake beside a wife who had already fallen asleep, her back turned to him as it had been for years. Tomorrow, he would have to find the courage to begin a conversation that might save his marriage or end it forever. Either way, there would be no going back to the comfortable lies that had sustained them for so long. The autumn wind rattled the palace windows, and Alexander found himself thinking about storms, how they could be destructive but also necessary, clearing away what was weak or dead to make room for new growth. Perhaps it was time to stop avoiding the storm that had been building in his life, and instead learn to dance in the rain. The conversation Alexander had been dreading came sooner than expected, though not in the way he had planned. 2 weeks after the harvest festival, Isabella requested a private dinner in her personal dining room, something that hadn't happened in over a year. Alexander accepted, though he approached the evening with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Isabella had chosen the smaller, more intimate dining room in her wing of the palace. Soft candlelight flickered across the antique furniture, and she had selected a wine from their honeymoon trip to Tuscany 30 years earlier. For a moment, Alexander wondered if his wife had sensed the distance between them and was attempting to bridge it. "This is lovely," Alexander said as he took his seat across from her. "It's been too long since we've dined alone together." "Yes, it has." Isabella's smile was polite, but didn't reach her eyes. "I thought it was time we had a proper conversation." Something in her tone made Alexander's stomach tighten. This wasn't going to be a romantic reunion dinner. Isabella waited until the servants had finished serving the first course and left them alone before speaking again. "Alexander, I think we need to discuss the state of our marriage." The directness of her statement surprised him. In 30 years together, Isabella had never been one to address personal issues head-on. She preferred to let problems resolve themselves or simply ignore them until they faded into the background of their busy lives. "I'm glad you brought it up," Alexander replied carefully. "I've been feeling that we've grown quite distant from each other." "Distant?" Isabella repeated the word as if testing its weight. "That's one way to put it. Another would be to say that we've been living separate lives under the same roof for several years now." Alexander studied his wife's face in the candlelight. There was no anger there, no hurt or accusation. Instead, she seemed remarkably calm, almost relieved to finally be speaking openly. "Isabella, I want you to know that if I've done anything to make you unhappy stop," she interrupted gently. "Let's not pretend this is about anything either of us has done wrong. We've both been perfectly adequate spouses. We've fulfilled our duties, raised our son, supported each other's public roles. But we've never been in love, have we?" The question hung in the air between them. Alexander had expected to be the one initiating this difficult conversation, but Isabella had surprised him by speaking the truth they had both been avoiding. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think we have. I've been doing some thinking lately," Isabella continued, cutting into her salmon with precise movements. "About what our marriage actually is versus what everyone assumes it to be. We're friends, I suppose, or at least we were once. We're good business partners in the enterprise of monarchy, but we're not lovers, we're not confidants, and we haven't been truly happy together in years." Alexander felt a mixture of relief and sadness at her words. Relief that she understood the situation as clearly as he did. Sadness that their long partnership had come to this moment of honest acknowledgement. "What are you saying, Isabella?" "I'm saying that I think we both deserve better than this." She set down her fork and looked directly at him. "I'm 51 years old, Alexander. I've spent my entire adult life being the perfect queen, the ideal royal wife. I've never complained about the arranged marriage, the lack of privacy, the constant scrutiny. But, lately, I've been wondering what it would be like to choose my own path for once." Alexander was stunned. In 3 decades of marriage, Isabella had never expressed any dissatisfaction with her role or their arrangement. She had seemed to thrive in the structured world of royal protocol. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" "I'm saying I think we should consider it. Not out of anger or resentment, but out of honesty about what our marriage has become and what we both might want for the rest of our lives." Alexander leaned back in his chair, processing this unexpected turn in the conversation. "Isabella, the implications of a royal divorce, the public reaction, the effect on Marcus, the constitutional questions. I know. I've been thinking about all of that too." She took a sip of wine before continuing. "But I've also been thinking about what kind of example we're setting for Marcus about marriage and relationships. Do we really want him to think that a loveless partnership is the best he can hope for?" It was a perspective Alexander hadn't considered. Their son was at an age where he would likely be thinking seriously about marriage himself soon, and the relationship he had observed between his parents would inevitably influence his expectations. "Have you met someone?" Alexander asked gently. Isabella smiled for the first time that evening, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Not in the way you mean. But I have been corresponding with Dr. James Whitman. You remember him from the medical charity I support? He's been widowed for 3 years, and we've discovered we have quite a lot in common. Our conversations have reminded me what it feels like to have someone genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions as a person, not just as a queen." Alexander felt a strange mixture of jealousy and happiness for his wife. Jealousy that she had found someone who appreciated her in ways he never had, and happiness that she might have the chance for real companionship after years of their polite coexistence. "Do you love him?" "I think I could. That's what's so extraordinary. I'm 51 years old, and I'm just now discovering what it might feel like to be genuinely cherished by someone. Alexander reached across the table and took her hand. I'm glad, Isabella. You deserve that. So do you. Her eyes met his with understanding. I've noticed how you are with Lady Catherine. Alexander's heart stopped. What do you mean? I mean, I've watched you during meetings when she's present. I've seen how you light up when she enters a room, how you listen to her opinions with a respect and attention that you've never shown to my ideas. I'm not blind, Alexander. The shame Alexander expected to feel didn't materialize. Instead, he felt relief at being seen and understood by someone who knew him better than anyone else in the world. Nothing inappropriate has happened, he said. I know. You're too honorable for that. But something could happen, couldn't it? If circumstances were different. Alexander nodded slowly. Yes, I think it could. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both absorbing the weight of what they had just admitted to each other. Their marriage was ending, not in anger or betrayal, but in a mutual recognition that they had outgrown the arrangement that had defined their adult lives. How would we do this? Alexander asked finally. The practical aspects, I mean. The announcement, the legal proceedings, the custody arrangements for official functions. Very carefully, Isabella replied. And with Marcus's full knowledge and support. I think we need to talk to him together before we make any final decisions. Alexander agreed. Their son deserved to understand their reasoning and to have input on a decision that would affect his own future as heir to the throne. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Isabella said. If we do this, if we divorce, I want you to promise me something. What's that? Don't let duty and propriety prevent you from finding happiness again. If there's a chance for you to have a real relationship with Catherine or anyone else, don't sacrifice it for the sake of appearances. Alexander felt tears threatening for the first time that evening. After 30 years of marriage, Isabella was giving him permission to pursue the love that had been growing in his heart. The same goes for you, he said. If Dr. Whitman makes you happy, if he sees you for who you really are, then you deserve that chance. The rest of their dinner passed in surprisingly comfortable conversation. They discussed practical matters, how to approach their son, what kind of timeline might work for a public announcement, how to minimize damage to the monarchy's reputation. But they also talked about their hopes for the future, their regrets about the past, and their gratitude for the friendship that had sustained them even when romantic love had never bloomed. As the evening ended, Isabella stood to leave, but paused at the door. Alexander, I want you to know that I don't regret our marriage. We may not have been lovers, but we were partners in something important. We raised a wonderful son together, and we've served this kingdom well. That's not nothing. No, it's not nothing, Alexander agreed. It's been an honor to serve alongside you, Isabella. After she left, Alexander remained in the small dining room, finishing his wine and contemplating the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the span of 2 hours, his entire future had changed. The marriage that had defined his adult life was ending, not in scandal or acrimony, but in a mature recognition that they both deserved more than they had been able to give each other. The next morning, Alexander and Isabella requested a private meeting with Prince Marcus. They met in the library, a neutral space where many important family conversations had taken place over the years. Marcus arrived looking concerned. It was unusual for both parents to request his presence without explaining the reason. Is everything all right? Marcus asked as he took a seat in one of the leather armchairs. Alexander and Isabella exchanged a look, and she nodded for him to begin. Marcus, your mother, and I have something important to discuss with you. It affects our family and your future role in the monarchy. Marcus straightened in his chair, clearly preparing himself for serious news. We've decided to pursue a divorce, Alexander continued. This isn't a decision we've made lightly, and it's not the result of any conflict or betrayal between us. It's simply an acknowledgement that our marriage has run its natural course. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing, processing this unexpected information. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured. Is this about Lady Catherine? Alexander felt his breath catch. What makes you ask that? I'm not blind, father. I've watched you with her. And I've watched you with mother. The contrast is pretty obvious to anyone paying attention. Isabella spoke for the first time. This is about your father and me realizing that we both deserve the chance to find real companionship and love, something our arranged marriage never provided. So you're both seeing other people? Not exactly, Alexander replied. But we've both come to understand that staying in a loveless marriage isn't serving anyone well. Not us, not the kingdom, and not you as you think about your own future relationships. Marcus stood and walked to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded both parents of his grandfather. What does this mean for the monarchy? He asked finally. For the line of succession, for public confidence in the royal family? Those are all important considerations, Isabella acknowledged. We'll need to handle the announcement very carefully, with full consideration of the constitutional implications. But, ultimately, we believe that authenticity and honesty will serve the monarchy better than maintaining a facade. Marcus turned back to face his parents. And what about afterward? Will you both remain in your roles? Will there be remarriage? We haven't worked out all the details yet, Alexander admitted. But, yes, I intend to continue as king, and your mother will maintain her charitable work and public duties, though her official role will obviously change. As for remarriage, Isabella added, that's a possibility we're both open to, though any future relationships would need to be handled with great care given our positions. Marcus was quiet for several more minutes, clearly working through the implications. When he spoke again, his words surprised both parents. I think you're being brave, he said. I've grown up watching you both fulfill your duties perfectly while sacrificing your personal happiness. If you have a chance to find love and companionship, you should take it. The monarchy will survive. It survived much worse than a royal divorce. Alexander felt a surge of pride in his son's maturity and wisdom. Thank you, Marcus. Your support means everything to both of us. Just promise me one thing, Marcus continued. If you do find happiness with someone else, don't let the critics and traditionalists make you feel guilty about it. You've given your whole life to this kingdom. You deserve some joy for yourselves. As their family meeting concluded, Alexander realized that the most difficult conversation he had been dreading had actually brought them closer together. His son's understanding and support made the path forward seem not just possible, but right. Later that afternoon, Alexander found himself once again in his study with Catherine, ostensibly reviewing correspondence, but actually working up the courage to share his news. The morning's revelations had changed everything, but he wasn't sure how to begin explaining the new possibilities that had suddenly opened up. Catherine, he said finally, setting aside the letters he had been pretending to read. I need to tell you something important. Last night, Isabella and I had a very frank conversation about our marriage. Catherine looked up from her notes, and he could see both hope and apprehension in her eyes. We've decided to divorce, Alexander continued. It was actually Isabella's suggestion. She's found someone who makes her happy, and she wants me to have the same chance. Catherine's hand went to her throat in surprise. Alexander, are you certain this is what you want? I'm certain that staying in a loveless marriage isn't serving anyone. And I'm certain that I want the chance to see where these feelings between us might lead, if you're willing to explore that possibility. For the first time in months, Catherine allowed herself to smile without restraint. I've been hoping you'd say something like that for longer than I should admit. Alexander stood and moved around his desk to where she sat. Then, we'll take this slowly, carefully, with full consideration of the challenges we'll face. But we'll take it together. As he reached for her hand, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine hope for the future. The storm he had been dreading was finally breaking, but instead of destruction, it was bringing the possibility of new growth, new love, and new happiness. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in decades, Alexander felt like he was walking towards something he truly wanted rather than simply fulfilling an obligation. And, beside him, Catherine squeezed his hand, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead together. The announcement of the royal divorce sent shockwaves through Astoria and beyond. Despite careful preparation by the palace communications team, the news dominated headlines for weeks and sparked intense debate about the future of the monarchy. Alexander had expected criticism, but the intensity of the public reaction still surprised him. The official statement, released 3 months after his conversation with Isabella, was deliberately measured and respectful. It emphasized the mutual nature of the decision, the continued cooperation between the former couple in their royal duties, and their joint commitment to their son and the kingdom. But no amount of careful wording could prevent the media frenzy that followed. Conservative members of parliament called for emergency sessions to discuss constitutional implications. Religious leaders issued statements ranging from disappointment to outright condemnation. International press speculated about the stability of the Asturian monarchy. Most painfully for Alexander, public opinion polls showed a significant drop in approval ratings for the royal family. Through it all, Catherine remained by his side in her official capacity as his advisor, though they had agreed to keep their personal relationship private until after the divorce was finalized. The constant scrutiny made even their professional interactions feel charged with tension, as every gesture and expression was analyzed by reporters looking for signs of scandal. "The Times is running an editorial calling for your abdication," Catherine reported during their morning briefing, 6 weeks after the announcement. The Telegraph is more supportive, saying that honesty about royal marriages is long overdue. Alexander rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of sleepless nights and constant stress. What about the polling numbers? Still declining, but the rate of decrease has slowed. Your approval rating is at 58%, down from 72% before the announcement. It was better than he had feared, but still painful to contemplate. Alexander had spent 20 years building trust with his people, and watching that trust erode felt like a personal failure. Any word from the Prime Minister's office about the constitutional review? They're expected to conclude that no formal action is required since you remain on the throne, and the line of succession is unchanged. But there will likely be recommendations about future protocols for royal marriages. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Prince Marcus entered, looking more serious than usual. "Father, I need to speak with you. Alone, if you don't mind, Lady Catherine." Catherine gathered her papers and left, giving Alexander an encouraging smile as she passed. Marcus waited until the door closed before speaking. "I've just come from a rather unpleasant conversation with Lord Pemberton and several other senior peers. They're planning to request a formal audience with you to express their concerns about the divorce and its impact on the monarchy." Lord Pemberton was one of the most conservative members of the House of Lords and had been openly critical of Alexander's decision. The prospect of facing a formal delegation of disapproving nobles was not appealing. What kind of concerns are they raising? The usual ones: damage to the monarchy's reputation, questions about moral leadership, worries about setting precedents for future generations. But there's something else, Father. They're also raising questions about Lady Catherine's role in your decision to divorce. Alexander felt his anger flare. What kind of questions? Whether she influenced your decision, whether your relationship with her was inappropriate before the divorce proceedings began, whether appointing her to any future official role would damage the crown's reputation. And what did you tell them? Marcus smiled grimly. "I told them that my father's personal happiness was none of their business, and that Lady Catherine has served the crown with distinction for 8 years. But I also warned them that public speculation about her role could damage both the monarchy and her personally." Alexander appreciated his son's loyalty, but he recognized the warning. If his relationship with Catherine became public knowledge before the divorce was finalized, it could transform the narrative from a mutual decision to end a loveless marriage into a scandal about adultery and abandonment of duty. "What do you recommend?" "Honestly, I think you need to consider whether pursuing a relationship with Catherine is worth the risk to both the monarchy and to her. The public might accept a divorced king eventually, but a king who appears to have left his wife for another woman? That's a much harder story to recover from." The conversation with Marcus haunted Alexander for the rest of the day. That evening, he walked alone through the palace gardens, trying to sort through the competing demands of his heart, his duty, and his concern for Catherine's well-being. The autumn air was crisp, and the gardens were nearly empty except for security personnel maintaining their discreet distance. He found Catherine sitting on a bench near the rose garden, wrapped in a wool coat, and staring at the fountain. She had been staying late at the palace more often recently, partly to avoid the reporters who had begun following her movements, partly to provide Alexander with support during the difficult transition period. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She moved over to make room for him on the bench. "Rough day. Marcus tells me that some of the peers are beginning to ask questions about us, about whether our relationship influenced my decision to divorce Isabella." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "I've been wondering when that would start. Catherine, I need you to know that if this becomes too difficult, if the scrutiny becomes too intense, I'll understand if you want to distance yourself from the situation." She turned to face him, her expression resolute. "Is that what you want me to do?" "No, but I want you to have the choice. I don't want you to feel trapped by circumstances I created." "Alexander, I went into this with my eyes open. I knew it would be difficult. What I didn't anticipate was how much the uncertainty would wear on me." "What do you mean?" "I mean that we're in this strange limbo where we've acknowledged our feelings for each other, but we can't act on them publicly or even privately while the divorce proceedings continue. Meanwhile, I'm watching you struggle with criticism and declining approval ratings, partly because of choices you made to create space for our relationship. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish by not removing myself from the equation. Alexander reached for her hand. You're not being selfish. If anything, I'm the one who's been selfish by putting you in this position. That's not true either. We both made choices that led us here. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the fountain and listening to the distant sounds of the city beyond the palace walls. Finally, Catherine spoke again. What if we took a break? What do you mean? I mean, what if I requested a temporary transfer to another department, just until the divorce is finalized and some of the initial controversy dies down? It would give you space to focus on rebuilding public trust without the complication of questions about us. And it would give me some breathing room to think clearly about whether I'm strong enough for what a relationship with you would ultimately require. Alexander felt a stab of panic at the thought of losing her support during the most difficult period of his reign. But he also recognized the wisdom in her suggestion. How long are you thinking? 6 months, maybe a year. Long enough for the situation to stabilize. And after that, we see where we both are. If you've weathered the storm and rebuilt your standing, and if I've decided I'm ready for the challenges that come with being in your life, then we explore what's possible between us. It wasn't what Alexander wanted to hear, but he understood Catherine's reasoning. The constant pressure and scrutiny were taking a toll on both of them, and perhaps some distance would provide clarity. Where would you go? The Cultural Ministry has an opening for a senior advisor position. It's important work, and it would keep me in the public sector without any appearance of impropriety. Alexander nodded slowly. If that's what you think is best, I'll support your decision. But, Catherine, I want you to know that taking this break doesn't change how I feel about you. I know. It doesn't change how I feel about you either. But sometimes love means being practical about timing and circumstances. 3 weeks later, Catherine's transfer was announced as a routine personnel move to broaden her experience in different government departments. The palace issued a statement thanking her for her years of distinguished service and wishing her well in her new role. To the public, it appeared to be a normal career transition. Privately, Alexander felt her absence acutely. Her replacement, while competent, lacked Catherine's intuitive understanding of his thinking patterns and preferences. More importantly, he no longer had the comfort of her presence during what continued to be a challenging period. The divorce proceedings moved forward smoothly, with both Alexander and Isabella working to minimize public drama. They appeared together at necessary state functions, maintaining a cordial relationship that demonstrated their mutual commitment to the kingdom's stability. Isabella's own happiness was evident to those who knew her well. Her correspondence with Dr. Whitman had evolved into a serious relationship, and she seemed more relaxed and genuine than she had in years. Meanwhile, Alexander threw himself into his royal duties with renewed determination. He increased his public appearances, launched new initiatives focused on education and economic development, and worked to demonstrate that his personal life changes hadn't diminished his commitment to the crown. Slowly, gradually, public opinion began to shift. A well-received speech about the importance of honesty and authenticity in leadership resonated with many citizens. His obvious dedication to his duties, combined with the dignified way both he and Isabella handled the divorce, began to restore some of the lost trust. 6 months after Catherine's transfer, Alexander's approval ratings had climbed back to 65%. The constitutional review had concluded with minimal recommendations for changes to royal protocols. Most importantly, the initial shock and controversy had faded enough that public discourse had moved on to other topics. During this period, Alexander and Catherine maintained minimal contact. They exchanged occasional professional messages when her new role intersected with palace business, but they avoided personal communication by mutual agreement. Alexander found himself missing not just her romantic potential, but her friendship and intellectual companionship. The test of their separation came during the winter holidays. Traditionally, this was a time for the royal family to make public appearances together, but with the divorce recently finalized, new arrangements had to be made. Alexander would host the main royal events, while Isabella would maintain her own separate holiday traditions. As Alexander prepared for the annual Christmas address to the nation, he realized how much he wanted to share the moment with Catherine. The speech was one of his most important of the year, and her insights had always helped him craft messages that truly connected with people. Instead, he worked with his new advisor, a capable woman named Margaret who handled the logistics efficiently but couldn't provide the creative collaboration he had grown to value with Catherine. The speech was perfectly adequate but lacked the warmth and personal touch that Catherine's input had always brought to his public addresses. On Christmas morning, Alexander delivered his address from the palace library, speaking about resilience, hope, and the importance of family bonds that transcended traditional structures. He spoke about his gratitude for his son's support, his respect for Isabella's ongoing service to the kingdom, and his commitment to leading with honesty and integrity. Later that day, he received a brief message from Catherine, beautiful speech, wishing you peace and happiness during the holidays. It was the first personal communication they had shared in months, and it reminded Alexander of everything he missed about her presence in his life. But it also reinforced his respect for her wisdom in suggesting their separation. The time apart had allowed him to rebuild his public standing without the complication of relationship speculation. As the new year approached, Alexander found himself contemplating what the future might hold. The worst of the divorce controversy had passed, and he had proven to himself and to his subjects that he could continue to serve effectively despite the personal changes in his life. The question now was whether the time was right to begin exploring the possibility of new happiness, or whether duty demanded he remain focused solely on his royal obligations. The answer to that question would come sooner than he expected, when circumstances forced both him and Catherine to confront whether their feelings had survived the test of separation and whether they were ready to face the challenges of building a relationship in the most public spotlight imaginable. Spring arrived early in Astoria, and with it came an unexpected crisis that would test everything Alexander had learned about leadership, love, and the courage to choose happiness. The crisis began with a natural disaster, severe flooding in the northern provinces that displaced thousands of families and caused extensive damage to infrastructure and farmland. Alexander's response was swift and decisive. He immediately activated emergency protocols, deployed military resources for search and rescue operations, and made plans to visit the affected areas personally. It was exactly the kind of situation where his experience and genuine care for his people could shine through the political noise that had surrounded his personal life. What he didn't expect was to discover that Catherine was already in the disaster zone, working with the cultural ministry to coordinate efforts to protect historic sites and artwork threatened by the flooding. When he arrived in the town of Millfield for his first relief site visit, he was surprised to see her among the officials briefing him on the situation. "Lady Catherine," he said formally, nodding as she was introduced by the emergency coordinator. "I wasn't aware the cultural ministry was involved in the relief efforts. Several historic churches and the regional museum were severely damaged," she explained, her professional demeanor carefully in place despite the personal undercurrent between them. "We're working to salvage artifacts and documents that represent centuries of local history." Alexander found himself studying her face as she spoke, noting how the months apart had only intensified his appreciation for her intelligence and dedication. She looked thinner than he remembered, and there were shadows under her eyes that suggested she had been working long hours on the relief efforts. "Perhaps you could show me the affected sites this afternoon," Alexander suggested. "I'd like to understand the full scope of the cultural damage." It was a reasonable request from a professional standpoint, but both of them understood the personal motivation behind it. Catherine glanced at the other officials present before nodding her agreement. The tour of damaged sites provided them with their first extended time alone in nearly a year. As they walked through the water-damaged museum, where volunteers were carefully cleaning mud from priceless artifacts, their conversation gradually shifted from purely professional topics to more personal terrain. "How have you been?" Alexander asked quietly as they stood before a 16th-century tapestry that might be irreparably damaged. "Busy. The cultural ministry has been an interesting challenge." Catherine paused, then added, "I've missed our conversations." "I've missed them too. More than I probably should admit." They were interrupted by a volunteer who needed Catherine's guidance on handling a damaged manuscript. But the brief exchange had re-established the connection between them. For the rest of the day, as Alexander met with flood victims and emergency workers, he found himself acutely aware of Catherine's presence and the easy way they fell back into their old collaborative rhythm. That evening, Alexander was scheduled to stay overnight in Millfield to continue relief efforts the next day. Catherine was staying in the same hotel, one of the few buildings in the town center that hadn't sustained water damage. When Alexander knocked on her door at 9 o'clock, she opened it immediately, as if she had been expecting him. "We need to talk," he said simply. She stepped aside to let him enter her small hotel room. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing all day." Alexander took a seat in the room's single chair while Catherine sat on the edge of the bed. The space between them felt charged with months of separation and unresolved feelings. "How has it really been?" he asked. "Not the professional update, but how are you?" Catherine smiled sadly. "Lonely. I thought the time apart would help me gain perspective, maybe diminish what I felt for you. Instead, it's just confirmed how important you are to me." "For me too. But I needed to prove to myself that I could handle the challenges of the divorce and the criticism without depending on you for emotional support. I needed to know I was choosing to be with you from a position of strength, not weakness. And now you know? I know that I'm a better king when I'm happy, and I'm happier when you're in my life. I know that the approval ratings and public opinion matter, but not more than living authentically. And I know that I love you, Catherine, not just as an advisor or a friend, but as the woman I want to share my life with." Catherine felt tears starting to form. "Alexander, I love you too. But are we really ready for what comes next? Because if we do this, if we make our relationship public, there's no going back. Every aspect of our lives will be scrutinized. Every decision we make will be questioned. Are you sure you want that for both of us?" "I'm sure that I want you. Everything else, we'll figure out together." Alexander stood and moved to sit beside her on the bed. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. "There's something else," Catherine said. "While we've been apart, I've been seeing a therapist, partly to deal with the stress of our situation, but also to understand why I was willing to risk everything for a relationship that might be impossible." "What did you learn?" "That I spent most of my adult life in a marriage where I minimized myself to keep the peace. When I divorced Robert, I swore I would never again be in a relationship where I couldn't be fully myself. With you, even given all the complications, I feel like I can be completely authentic. That's worth fighting for." Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Then, let's fight for it." The kiss that followed was their first, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as months of separation and longing found expression. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "What happens now?" Catherine whispered. "Now we go back to the capital and we tell the truth. We announce our relationship publicly, we face whatever criticism comes, and we build a life together despite the challenges. The press will go crazy. The traditional nobility will be scandalized. Your approval ratings might drop again. Maybe. Or maybe the public will appreciate honesty over pretense. Maybe they'll understand that even kings deserve love." They spent the rest of the evening talking about practical considerations, how to manage the announcement, what Catherine's role might be if their relationship became official, how to handle security and protocol issues. But underneath the logistics was a sense of relief and joy at finally being able to stop hiding their feelings. The next morning brought tragic news that put their personal concerns into perspective. A dam failure upstream had caused a second wave of flooding, and several people were missing. Alexander immediately threw himself into coordinating expanded rescue efforts, while Catherine worked to evacuate cultural sites in the newly threatened areas. Working side by side during the crisis, they rediscovered the partnership that had first drawn them together. Alexander valued Catherine's insights on logistics and communication, while she appreciated his ability to make quick decisions under pressure and his genuine concern for every affected citizen. Local media covering the disaster noticed their obvious professional chemistry, but in the context of emergency response, it seemed natural rather than scandalous. When a photographer captured them standing together while surveying flood damage, both looking exhausted but determined, the image would later become symbolic of their partnership. 3 weeks after returning to the capital, Alexander made his decision. He called a press conference, not to discuss policy or state business, but to address his personal life directly. "Over the past year, I have learned important lessons about honesty, authenticity, and the courage required to live according to one's values rather than others' expectations," he began, standing at the podium in the palace press room, while Catherine watched from the back of the room. "Today, I want to share with you something that brings me great happiness and hope for the future. I am in love with Lady Catherine Morrison, and I have asked her to consider marriage. She has graciously agreed to explore that possibility with me." The room erupted in questions and camera flashes, but Alexander continued speaking. "I know this announcement will provoke discussion and perhaps criticism. Some will question the appropriateness of my relationship with a former advisor. Others may doubt my judgment or priorities. I respect those concerns, and I understand that my personal choices affect more than just my own life. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. But I have also learned that a king who is not true to himself cannot serve his people authentically. Lady Catherine has been my friend, my advisor, and my inspiration for 8 years. She has made me a better person and a better leader. I believe that our partnership, both personal and professional, will strengthen rather than weaken my service to this kingdom. Alexander concluded by announcing that Catherine would be returning to the palace in a senior advisory role, working on initiatives related to cultural preservation and education. He emphasized that their relationship would develop alongside her independent career and contributions to public service. The reaction was immediate and intense. Progressive media outlets praised Alexander's honesty and courage, while conservative commentators questioned his judgment and priorities. Public opinion polls showed a divided response. Younger citizens and those in urban areas were largely supportive, while older and more traditional demographics expressed concern. But there was also a surprising amount of positive reaction. Many people appreciated Alexander's willingness to speak honestly about love and happiness, particularly after witnessing the dignified way he and Isabella had handled their divorce. Social media filled with messages of support from couples who had found love later in life or after divorce. Most importantly for Alexander, his son Marcus publicly endorsed the relationship, stating that he had never seen his father happier or more energized in his royal duties. Isabella also issued a gracious statement expressing her happiness for Alexander and welcoming Catherine to the extended royal family. 6 months later, Alexander and Catherine announced their engagement. The wedding, held the following spring, was a smaller affair than traditional royal weddings but was filled with genuine joy and celebration. Catherine wore a simple but elegant gown designed by an Asturian designer, and their vows included promises to support each other's individual growth alongside their shared life. The ceremony was broadcast live, and viewership numbers exceeded expectations. The public seemed genuinely moved by the obvious affection between the couple and the authentic emotions displayed throughout the event. Alexander's approval ratings, which had fluctuated during the announcement period, stabilized at healthy levels as people adjusted to the new reality of their king's happiness. In his wedding speech, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought him to that moment. I have learned that true leadership sometimes requires the courage to disappoint those who prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths. I have learned that authentic happiness is not selfish but essential. A happy leader serves more effectively than a dutiful but miserable one. Most importantly, I have learned that love, when it is real and honest, strengthens rather than weakens our ability to serve others. Looking out at the gathered guests and knowing that millions more were watching around the kingdom, Alexander felt a sense of completeness he had never experienced before. He had chosen love over convenience, authenticity over appearance, and hope over fear. The crown he wore felt lighter now, not because his responsibilities had diminished, but because he was carrying them with a partner who truly understood and supported his deepest values. As he and Catherine danced their first dance as husband and wife, Alexander reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 years. He had ended a loveless marriage, weathered intense public scrutiny, and rebuilt his relationship with his subjects on a foundation of honesty rather than pretense. Most importantly, he had found love with someone who made him not just happier, but better. The future would bring new challenges, of course. Catherine would have to navigate the complexities of being a queen who had risen from outside the traditional nobility. Alexander would continue to balance his personal happiness with his royal duties. Their children, if they were blessed with any, would grow up in an even more intense spotlight than previous royal generations. But as they moved together to the music, surrounded by family and friends, Alexander felt confident that they could face whatever came next. They had already proven that love could survive separation, scrutiny, and the enormous pressures of royal life. Together, they had chosen truth over comfort, authenticity over appearance, and hope over fear. The crown's choice had ultimately been the heart's choice, and Alexander had never felt more certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly the person he was meant to love. The kingdom of Astoria had gained not just a new queen, but a royal couple whose love story proved that even fairy tales could be real, complicated, and ultimately triumphant. In the years that followed, historians would mark Alexander and Catherine's wedding as a turning point for the modern monarchy, a moment when the institution proved it could evolve and adapt while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. But on that perfect spring evening, as they celebrated their new beginning, all that mattered was the simple truth that love had won, and they would face the future together, hand in hand, heart to heart, ready for whatever adventures awaited them.